and welcome back to another episode of Contrapologetics. I'm Ryan, and recently I was invited by YouTuber Potential Theist to join him on his channel and discuss our good friend Frank Turek. And our discussion was about Frank Turek's well-known book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And in particular, we walked through one of his campus presentations that he gave, which is based on the book. So his presentations also go by the title, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Now, if you don't know who Potential Theist is, he is a wonderful fellow. I had a great time, and if you are not subscribed to him, or if you've never heard of him, I would highly recommend that you go and subscribe to his channel, and in fact, it is linked in the description below. But this episode is going to basically be that discussion, so I hope you enjoy it, and if you would like to see more discussions on things like this, so maybe more in-depth takedowns of presentations like those given by Turek, let me know in the comments. But like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, and I hope you enjoy it, and let's go.
All right, boys and girls, get the popcorn, get the Milk Duds, and the Sour Patch Kids. Get your beverage of choice. You might need an adult beverage for this. We're looking at a horror film today. That's the only way I can describe it. It's a horror film. Ryan, so we were just talking off air that you read I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek. Was that your first time reading it, or have you read it before?
So I'm kind of, I would say, very familiar with Turek and his presentations. I've had this book for a long time, and I constantly get stuck reading it because of how many issues I have with it. So
I thought you were gonna say how great it is.
Oh, it's page turner. Yeah.
So Ryan,
yeah.
So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, folks who might not know who you are?
So I'm Ryan, obviously, and I am part of the group Real Atheology. Many might know them from kind of the main faces of Real Atheology being Justin and Justin Schieber and Ben Watkins, kind of the originators of the group. So there's kind of a bunch of us that are part of that group, and so I help contribute over there. And I also recently started another YouTube channel kind of meant for tackling specifically apologetics, and I called it Contrapologetics. So yeah, I have that going on too. But yeah, so I work with the Real Atheology team, and it's a lot of fun.
Okay, and I have the Real Atheology website listed in the description. You can also find them on X. It's Real Atheology. If you send me the link to your YouTube channel, Ryan, I'll put it in the description as well.
Okay.
You can also find me on X. It's at Potential Theism. As always, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Ryan, why don't we jump right into it, because we got a lot of material to go through here. So we're going to be looking at a presentation from Frank Turek from Auburn University in Alabama. So this was it was recent. Let's look at it. It's from 2 months ago. So let me pull that up real quick. Actually, before we do that, I want to show you this tweet. I don't know if you saw this, Ryan.
Okay.
It's showing up there.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
so I'll read it to everyone. It says, "Our goal in apologetics should be never to dunk on atheists. We should try to keep the conversation open. Learn how to do that well in my updated and expanded course, Why I Still Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, starting January 15th. So, Ryan, what do you make of that? We should never try to dunk on atheists after looking through his presentation and reading his book.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with Turek, it sounds laudable. Like, yeah, I appreciate that. You shouldn't dunk on atheists, and we should be civil and charitable, and that sounds great. And maybe people will see that when they look through this video. If you've seen a Turek presentation, or if anybody has read his book, you get the feeling he's kind of being a bit duplicitous here. Like, he's kind of putting on one face, but it sure feels like he tries to dunk on atheists a lot. Actually,
Yeah,
and even
spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, he's going to try to dunk on atheists. So.
Yeah. Mainly, not necessarily in the sense of like outright insults or anything like that, but a lot of the things he says are like blatant mischaracterizations of atheist positions that are just like egregious, and so it really feels like he's not being genuine here.
Yeah, he may not be going for insults, but it's fairly insulting. So,
Yes, I agree with that.
so that was advertising his course. So let me pull up this course real quick. You'll get a kick out of this. Have you seen his courses?
I haven't. Well, I've seen him advertise a bunch of courses. I think they put out so many, but yeah, I've never like gone to their
So
website
look
and looked.
look at the price of this one, $269.
Goodness.
So some people may be wondering why we're going over a book from 20 years ago, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which is one of the reasons I wanted to use the presentation as well. Um, but the truth is, he still uses this material. His podcast is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He's obviously doing a course, I Still Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and charging $269 for it. So this is very much relevant. I wanted to look at his course, or excuse me, at his presentation, so we could look at the most updated and refined version of it. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right in? So let
Sounds
me
great.
pull that up as well. So as you know, Ryan, in the presentation, he goes over 4 questions. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament true? So let's start with the first one. Does truth exist?
Mhm.
Exist. And whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson,
All right,
right?
we're gonna fast forward a
Of a
little
lot
bit.
of pain and suffering. Logic in public school. If
Let me check the timestamps.
that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to say that here at Auburn? You can't handle the truth. Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. They're saying, you got your truth, I got my truth. All truth is relative. Well, if you
Okay, so let's stop right there. You got your truth, I got my truth. All truth is relative. Any thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, so I think it's so this presentation. This is one of those things where Turek sort of has a. He's a dynamic speaker. Well, I find him to be actually very annoying to listen to, but he's definitely like good at giving presentations, and so he kind of gives this air of authority, I think, when he talks, and he kind of dazzle, and I guess we'll see this as we go, but he kind of tries to dazzle his audience with like facts and sort of random trivia that he knows, and puts these things out here, but he makes like very general statements a lot, and I don't know, I don't want to be like uncharitable and say that he does this on purpose, or like he's trying to be um deliberately deceptive in some way, but he kind of has a sense, or a way of like I said, mischaracterizing things. And he makes these broad generalizations like our culture today teaches that there's no truth, or everybody's saying out there in the culture that you have your truth and I have my truth. Or college, when he goes to these campuses, he's always like saying these colleges are teaching you that there's no truth. And I'm just like, I mean, I'm in academics and I teach, and I've never ever heard or been in a class where the teacher said anything like that. In fact, I very rarely see people claim things like that. You get some weird, like wishy-washy, or like woo-woo people that you see every now and again, or new agey type of people who might say things similar to that. But for the most part, I think he's kind of like, he just needs it to fit in his presentation, and so he kind of makes it, this is what everybody's saying, or at least he makes it feel like that's what everybody's saying. So you're going to run into this problem, and I just like, I've never had someone really tell me that. So I
You know
don't
what the
know.
problem is, Ryan? You don't teach at the university from God's Not Dead. That's the
Correct.
problem. Like if you were at that university, you would hear it all the time.
Yes.
Um,
That's
no,
right.
you're right. He's a very good speaker. It's my understanding that before he was in apologetics, he did leadership speaking for like major companies or something like that. So
Yes.
he's a very gifted communicator. And throughout the presentation, he's fast moving and he goes through this material quick. And
Hmm.
you're right. And one of the things I noticed is when he makes these statements, I don't remember a single time where he like showed an example of somebody saying this. Can you think of an example of him doing that?
No, yeah, I like, he doesn't bring anything up in he makes this claim about postmodernism. He sort of boils down postmodernism. So I guess maybe that's the only thing he references, is that he claims in a little bit that postmodernism is the view that there is no objective truth, or no absolute truth. I think something like that, which is sort of hilarious. I mean, just to
In
reduce like an
fact,
entire
let's go to
viewpoint.
that.
Yeah,
Let's go to that timestamp.
yeah.
Let me find it real quick. Okay.
Suppose someone were to come up to you and say there is no truth.
Yeah, he just makes up people.
This is the relativistic postmodernist claim. Someone says there is no truth. You should ask that person a question. What should the question be?
Is that true?
Is it true?
Which, I mean, yeah, if someone did ask you or say that, I mean, yeah, that would be a good question. And he says this is like a really important thinking skill, which partly he's right. To see if a truth is self-defeating, I mean, that's a skill to use in philosophical thinking. But he sort of contrives like all these examples to make them like just right, and he sort of leaves out all the nuance. And like people just will come up to you and ask you these obviously self-refuting claims, and he seems to just have like no charity, that people are just making the most absurd claims.
Let's talk about this for a minute. So
Yeah.
he calls this the roadrunner tactic, right? So he's basically trying to show that an argument can't bear its own weight. And so somebody says there is no truth. He has this rhetorical gotcha. Well, is that true?
Right.
Well, if you're trying to be charitable, I would think instead of a rhetorical gotcha, a good follow-up would be, well, what do you mean by that? There is no truth.
Right.
And I don't think the person who says there is no truth means like there is no I'm absolutely certain there is no truth. And he kind of goes on and he says, if somebody says there is no absolute truth, you should say to them, is that absolutely true that there is no absolute truth? And I can understand again, like why that would be a tempting rhetorical gotcha. But I don't think that person is saying with certainty that there is no absolute truth. They're saying something like, well, it's probably the case there is no absolute truth. So they're making like a probabilistic claim rather than like an absolute claim. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think most people are going to mean something a little bit, like I said, nuanced. And so I like that idea of, it's good to ask follow-up questions and not, I feel like he's trying to, like you said, score rhetorical points, so he can dunk on the person and just sort of mic drop them, rather than, asking, what do you mean by that? I mean, it's a good question to be like, so are you saying that that's absolutely true? And what do you mean by that? That would be, I think, more conversationally appropriate. And I think maybe the person just means something like, we can't be absolutely certain about things, or most things, or, most people in regular conversations too aren't like, I mean, we've all experienced this in everyday conversations. We're not like super analytic philosophers who are like extremely careful with all of our wording, So to just like be overly pedantic right out of the gate, I think is like kind of a dick move, if you will.
Well, I think that's what he's doing here. He's sort of playing word games, and he's taking advantage of the fact that people may have sloppy or imprecise language, and then he's trying to make them feel cornered and get them flustered.
Yeah.
Again, it's just a rhetorical gotcha. It's not a good way to have a conversation with someone if you want to understand what they believe and what they mean.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's see what our next timestamp is.
He's got quite a few of these examples.
Yeah.
And most of them, like I said, are not, they're very contrived. Like he sets them up to obviously fail in the most obvious
If you turn the
way.
claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Yeah, is that a relative truth? No. Can everyone see this is an absolute truth claim, claiming all truths are relative? It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Or how about this one? In fact, in our culture, it's more often said this way, or at least intimated this way. There isn't the truth, only my truth. I've got my truth. You've got your truth. You live your truth.
Okay, so there isn't the truth, only my truth. But then he says, you've got your truth and my truth. Aren't those two different claims? I don't know. There isn't.
Yeah, this kind of goes, he brings up the next one. It's like, it's true for you, but not for me. I think they're kind of similar, but.
So this one, there isn't the truth, only my truth. I've never heard it put it that way. I have heard it put, you've got your truth and I've got my truth. And I've got my own thoughts on that. So
yeah,
when I hear somebody say that, I think context is important, right? And usually in the context, it's usually in a disagreement between two people.
Yeah.
And let's say one person has their religious belief and the other person doesn't. And they're usually just saying it in the context of, well, I don't really want to argue about this. We're not going to agree. So you got your truth, I got my truth. So again, he's just taking advantage of like sloppy language to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's mostly just a way of saying I believe what I believe and you believe what you believe, and there's like no obvious way we're going to solve this right now between us. I don't think the person is necessarily saying this in any literal sense, that there are things that are true for you but don't apply to me somehow, and vice versa. But yeah, I think it's like a more sloppy way of saying, well, this is what I believe, and you believe what you believe, and we each have our reasons, and you're not going to change your mind, and I'm not going to change my mind right now. So yeah, probably like you said, they don't want to continue the conversation at that point.
So do you have any thoughts on the prior one? All truth is relative.
um, yeah, I mean, I think if someone makes that claim, I'm not a fan of that claim. I mean, maybe I've heard some people say stuff like that, but again, I think it's probably missing nuance. I mean, I don't think all truth is relative, so I feel like Turek um, sets these things up, as if like atheists are left and right claiming that everything is relative, which of course is silly. But like I said, most people aren't saying stuff like this, except for maybe some really high new age people occasionally.
And that's the weird part about this, because this is a presentation on I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I don't think I've ever heard an atheist say something along the lines of "You got your truth and I got my truth." Have you ever heard an atheist say anything like that?
No, because I mean, well, not that atheists are um, always the most rational, but usually atheists tend to at least pay lip service to the importance of science, where they're going to think that, right, that's our way of getting at truth, and of course they're trying to argue that Christianity isn't true. So I don't think that anybody would really thoughtfully subscribe to and just say, oh, well, that's just relative. It might actually be true for you, but it isn't for me. I mean, yeah, I've never come across any thoughtful person that said that. Really, atheist or otherwise, I guess. Um, yeah,
And one of the things I want to stress throughout this stream is the principle of charity,
yeah,
um, and really Frank Turek's lack of charity. And it doesn't bother me so much that he lacks charity and that he has bad arguments. It bothers me that he's teaching other Christians and lay apologists to lack charity. And we've seen the consequences of that in our interactions with online apologists. And take, for example, going through all these examples. Once again, a lot of these things, like I'm trying to think, like, do atheists say this? And another thing is like he never goes over well, and then some atheists talk about objective truth and absolute truth. Like he never describes atheists that I know that
yeah,
have different views than the ones that are being listed here. He makes it seem like this is all that atheists are saying, stuff like, well, you have your truth and I have my truth, all truth is relative. And
hmm
as you said, there's not really one atheist view. Atheists have different views, and even individual atheists will have nuances in their view. And so again, you have to ask follow-up questions. You have to ask, what do you mean by that? Like if somebody says all truth is relative, what do you
yeah,
mean by that? You got your truth, I got my truth. Well, what do you mean by that? Like,
yeah.
again, it's just a lack of charity.
I think this becomes especially problematic too. I've seen this online a lot, where I actually have interacted with people who will take these things Turek says and they try to use them, sort of not thinking through it very carefully. So he kind of paints this picture that atheists don't believe in anything absolute. And a lot of those people who just sort of take what Turek says is like, absolutely correct, will misapply it. So for instance, as we were just saying, I don't really know of any atheists I can think of who have stated that all truth is relative. However, you do have atheists who, in the specific area of moral philosophy, think that morality is relative, right? That there are no objective moral truths specifically, and right, that they're moral anti-realists, and not all atheists are moral anti-realists, but there are some who think that there are no moral truths. But then you'll get people like Frank Turek's followers who will latch onto that, right? And they'll think that, oh, they're making this is my time to shine. I'm going to throw one of these gotcha statements at them, and I've seen people say this very thing. Someone will be talking about morality specifically, and will say, yeah, I think morality is relative. And then someone will come in and say, well, is that true? Right? Like, yeah, I think it is true. I think morality is relative. I'm not saying that for me. For a hypothetical atheist could say, yeah, I do think morality is relative. Like, what's your point? And then they'll just keep going like, but is that true? And they're sort of conflating this idea of relativity, in one specific domain, and they're trying to sort of force that atheist into saying that, well, no, you must be saying everything is relative. And I think it's because they're trying to play this game that Turek kind of sets up or idealizes in his presentations. And so the, would-be apologist who's following him is wanting, to see every situation play out like that. And unfortunately, it's like, no, there's a lot more going on there. So that's a problem I've seen specifically from stuff that directly comes from what Turek tries to present.
All right, so the next one is even more bizarre. So let's go ahead and play this one.
How about this? You hear this in the engineering department.
Yeah,
There's no truth in anything but science.
You hear this in the engineering department, again, in the university from God's Not Dead.
Yeah.
Who even says this?
Yeah, this is another one. Again, I've never heard anyone claim there's no truth in anything but science, and never an engineer. I've never heard an engineer claim that. So yeah, this was a really weird one. Again, you hear a lot in terms of claims of scientism. That's kind of the buzzword, I think, or the label that's put on it. But for the most part, I think that's a misunderstood, position. I'm not saying I hold to scientism, but for the most part, I don't think anybody would say no truth exists in anything but science whatsoever. That's like one of those exaggerated claims. It's just like no nuance whatsoever.
Okay, so this last one is also bizarre. So let's go to this one. If I can get to it a little further. There we go.
How about this? This is probably the biggest one in our culture. You ought not judge. In fact, if you're a Christian, they'll say, Jesus said don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrites?
All right, so I didn't get this one. I've heard people say that you ought not judge, and it's usually like a critique of Christians, whether they do it sloppy or not, but they're critiquing the Christian that's being judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
But what does this have to do with atheism?
Yeah, I don't know. And he goes on. I don't know how much of this portion you want to watch, but he does he kind of goes on and on and on about judging, and he brings up what Jesus actually meant by a bunch of stuff, and for some reason, atheists are really concerned about Jesus saying you shall not judge. I mean, I have heard people say, you shouldn't judge. Doesn't Jesus say not to judge, when Christians are being overly judgmental? So this one maybe is a little bit more accurate in terms of what you'll sometimes hear people say. But
it's usually a critique, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's usually something like they actually mean something like what Jesus said. Like, why are you being so critical when you, right, are just as bad or something like that, or you're being hypocritical? Or, usually it's like people who are overly negative, always criticizing people. I don't think it's someone saying you should never make a judgment or you should never say something negative towards somebody or things like that. So again, it's like exactly what you said. You need to ask these follow-up questions. Like, what do you mean by that? This is usually not some kind of universal statement. It's usually like context dependent and has something to do with, maybe the Christian exhibiting a lack of moral character themselves in the way they judge people. That seems That
All
seems
right,
to
so
be.
let's go to the next example.
Sibling, by the way. And then in Matthew 23, Jesus really goes after these Pharisees. What does he say? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Oh, you look great on the outside. You're whitewashed.
Hold on, I didn't go far enough.
Yeah, he goes on quite a while on that.
Yeah, I just want to skip that, but I want to go to this last one.
Yeah.
False because they claim it's true that there is no truth. Now, tragically, many of our high schools and most of our universities, maybe here with the exception of Auburn, have bought into postmodernism. That's why you're seeing crazy ideas on campus right now. But it's false. I mean, why would you pay $30,000 a year to have some professor tell you the truth that there is no truth?
So Ryan, is that what you're doing in your classes?
That's what I do every day in my math classes. I get up and I tell them there are no truths. I make sure to emphasize that every class period. So, yeah, I've never. That's the picture he paints, is that professors are just left and right saying there's no truth at all. And again, I've never ever heard that. Even in when I was taking classes, I take philosophy courses because that's usually where I think Frank thinks these things happen. Like you said, in the God's Not Dead sort of universe, where the terrible philosophy professor, is teaching these things. But I've had actually blatant or not very outspoken atheist professors in philosophy, and they were never said anything like that. Quite the opposite, in fact. Very liberal teachers, never heard it, not even suggested. So, I mean, unless this is like some secret thing that's happening, I don't know where he gives no examples, so it's hard to know what he's really referring to.
And that's one of the problems I already highlighted is he provides no examples for any of these. So
Yeah.
let's
So I
let's
mean,
let's go on.
Not a Christian here. Thank you for being here. But if you're not a Christian and you ask a question, I may ask you a question. And it's not fair of me to do that unless I tell you the question in advance. So I'm going to tell you right now. Here's the question I might ask you. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists.
So let me answer that because I'm the potential theist, right?
mhm.
So if Christianity were true, yes, I would become a Christian. All right, let's go on.
Stand at that microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no. No. Wait, I thought you claimed to be reasonable. I thought you claimed to be rational. How is it reasonable and rational you wouldn't believe something that were true?
So can we stop there real
Well,
quick?
it's not about reason.
Yeah. So here's something that really bothered me about this presentation is again, he's a good presenter and he's quick, but he does these subtle shifts, and this is a spot where he does a very subtle shift in what he says. So you notice he asked the question, if Christianity were true, um, and the assumption I'm guessing is what he means by that is if you knew that Christianity were true. So if you could be presented and be certain that Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And so then what that really means is, if you ask Frank, what does it mean to be a Christian? It's not just belief. So notice he says, I thought you were rational. You're saying you wouldn't believe it if it were true. But there's a big difference between being a Christian and believing that Christianity is true. So even Frank would admit this, that belief is not sufficient. In fact, he would probably even cite James, where James talks about even the demons believe and aren't saved. And so obviously demons aren't Christians, but yet they believe that Christianity is true because they have this knowledge or whatever. And so he makes this shift, right? So I think he asks an irrelevant question actually at first, like, would you become a Christian? And I don't think the atheist has to say yes, because they're not saying they wouldn't believe it if they were presented with sufficient evidence. They're saying they wouldn't follow it. And that's different than just belief. It takes more than just belief, even on Turek's view. What you need to do is not only believe, but you need to follow Jesus, right? You need to worship Jesus, accept him as Lord. And that's something extra. So he changes the subtle shift here, and he criticizes the atheist for saying no, as if they are being illogical, right? Like, I refuse to believe even in spite of all this evidence. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying, hey, yeah, I would agree it's true in that case, but I still wouldn't follow Jesus, right? Or I still wouldn't be a Christian. And that's different. So I think that's a sneaky sort of thing there that he does. Again, I'm not saying he's doing it on purpose, but I think it is a serious error.
And I think it may be the case that many of the people who are answering that way, if in fact they do answer that way, I don't necessarily believe him, um, is maybe they come from a background where the version of Christianity that they were exposed to was like a hellfire and brimstone kind of judgmental form of Christianity where God is basically a monster. And
For
I don't
sure.
see a problem with them rejecting a God like that. Though it's important to
Absolutely.
note that they're not saying that God exists at all. They're just saying if that God exists, which is
Yes.
the picture of God that they've been exposed to, they wouldn't worship him.
Exactly. Yes, I think that's exactly what they're trying to say. Is like, yeah, so I know that there's this being there that kills people whenever it wants to and sends them to hell. I wouldn't love that being. I wouldn't follow that being. Yeah, I think that's exactly what they're trying to say. Not that they would say I just don't believe that exists in the face of all this proof. It's exactly right. They
Well,
wouldn't worship.
let me give an example in my own life. So
Yeah.
recently, I had a falling out with a friend, and I was talking to another friend, and I said, we're never ever going to patch things up. I don't want anything to do with them. Basically, I hate them. I don't want anything to do with them anymore. Um, and I was just adamant, like we're not having a relationship with one another. But that person ended up coming to my apartment, and it was like as soon as I opened that apartment, all that melted away. And very quickly we were friends again. So I think some of these people that say that, they may
Mhm.
mean it, but if a loving and good God exists, I think they would probably worship that God. So
Yeah.
for me, like if I were convinced Christianity was true, I would look for the best version of Christianity.
Mm.
And so like when people say stuff like that, I think in their mind, once again, like they have this picture of a form of Christianity that's toxic and where God's kind of a monster.
Mhm. I think that's exactly right. A lot of criticism towards atheists is that they're literally God haters, and they'll throw out examples like that. Well, there's people who say like I would never worship this God, and or I would never want to go to heaven to be with that kind of a being, and they're referring to that specific type of um, being. So, like you said, they're sincere, but maybe they have um, they're reacting to a particular picture of God. That's right. That they've been
And
presented.
what bothers me about this is he takes these examples of these alleged atheists. Again, I don't necessarily believe him that he's experienced, but he takes them as evidence that for all atheists, it's a heart problem, not a head problem, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
He
I just
says
have a problem with that.
Yeah, in fact, if we play it here in a minute, he even says in a moment, he'll say, like, if the person, so he asks them this question, which again, I think it's sort of I personally think it's a bit of an irrelevant question. I don't think, even if a person says no, that means their objections are not intellectual, um, or that a person doesn't have well thought out objections. But anyway, he says that even if the person hesitates, they have a quote heart problem and not a head problem. And I think that's like, well, wait a minute, like that's pretty. It's kind of setting, kind of poisoning the well here, in a sense.
You don't know why they're hesitating. You're just
Yeah,
speculating on why they're hesitating.
exactly. So he's psychoanalyzing them, and sort of leaving no room for the person to even like consider the question thoughtfully and make sure they give a reasonable answer. It's like, no, I'm going to write you off now as having a you just don't want it to be true, which is that's an unfortunate way to approach people, I think.
So after we're done with this stream, I'll go back and add the link to the presentation so folks can see Frank's presentation for themselves. I know I'm bouncing around a lot. We just got to move through it. So let me go to the next one.
It's quite
So
long.
the next question. Let's see him introduce the next question. If I can pull it up. 3220.
Question: is it true that God exists? And I mentioned there are three arguments we're going to look at. And we're going to spend a lot of time on these arguments because they're critical to the whole case. three arguments for the existence of God. There's more than this, but these are the three we're going to talk about. The first is the argument from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. Now, cosmological just comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe. And it says if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design, known as the teleological argument. Telos is a Greek word meaning design or purpose. And it says if there's design in the universe and design in you, life, then there's got to be a designer. These two arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. The third argument isn't science, it's more philosophical, yet it's the argument you've all intuitively understood since you were a very small child. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says if there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one. Like it's wrong to torture babies for fun.
I don't know why that
Or
was
it's
funny to
wrong
me.
to torture babies, rape women, desecrate their bodies, and then burn them. Then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no God, that's just your opinion against a terrorist's opinion.
So I told you you're going to do the heavy lifting in this section. I'm the potential theist. I'm still weighing these arguments. So what do you make of that so far?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, I mean, yeah, these are like three very common arguments. They're pretty much his favorite arguments. A little nitpicky, the cosmological. I mean, there's no the cosmological argument. It's like a whole family of arguments. And the one he gives is kind of like I would call it a kind of a strangely worded version of the Kalam cosmological argument. He says everything that begins to exist has a beginner. People like William Lane Craig would say everything that begins to exist has a cause. And then, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. He phrases it slightly differently, but he's basically talking about the Kalam cosmological argument specifically. And then, again, the teleological argument is sort of a family of arguments as well. And so it looks like he's focusing mostly on design and fine-tuning. And then morality also, there's a variety of moral arguments. And he likes to focus on, this idea of the nature of morality. If it's to be objective, you have to have, for some reason, this ultimate person, God, to do the to somehow make that work. I believe he's a divine command theorist specifically, but yeah, I think these are pretty standard arguments. My problem with Frank here is not so much that he uses these arguments. They're interesting arguments. The Kalam has generated a lot of philosophy. Teleological arguments and design arguments have generated a lot of interesting discussions and things with science and the crossover between science and philosophy and morality. I find morality to be exceedingly interesting and also incredibly complicated and confusing. So I mean, they're interesting. They're each interesting arguments. So I have no problem that Turek uses these arguments. I have a problem with how he uses them and how he presents himself. So Turek sort of gives this air of that he's giving you the definitive, like, final truth, that this has been figured out, this has been settled, and these are like knockdown arguments. And he just gives no hint whatsoever that these are like very deep, very contested arguments with many proponents on both sides and very little agreement between them. So that's sort of the problem I have, is that he gives this false impression when he uses these arguments. And he also gives like very poor versions of them. So like there's far more sophisticated versions of these arguments. And I get it, he's presenting it to a lay audience, but I think he still does it in a way that's like really misleading and just too superficial, to the point where it's like not good.
All right, so let's go to the next example here.
Atheistic scientists are admitting it. Stephen Hawking, who was probably the top physicist in the world until he died about 6 years ago. Some of you may know Hawking was a medical miracle. He had ALS like for 45 years or so. Normally it kills you in a couple years. He lived with it for decades. But he was an atheist. Nevertheless, he said this: Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now, Hawking tried to come up with another explanation other than God for this. He failed, but he's admitting the data that space, time, and matter literally had a beginning out of nothing. Now, there's a lot of evidence for this.
All right, so I know you have a problem with that. So lay into Frank here.
Yeah, I think he really likes to use Hawking a lot. And I mean, I understand Hawking was a genius, and obviously he's very well known. But yeah, I think this is one of those things where he presents like some things that are, and he does this a lot in the book too. He has some things in there that are kind of correct, and then it's sort of mixed in with a lot of things that are like not correct and sort of like mischaracterized, and he gives us like false picture. So it's kind of like a little bit of correct things sprinkled in with with the rest of it, and he just sort of dazzles people with this. So it's like, oh wow, Stephen Hawking said that. Okay, so that's he's like the only scientist I know, so it must be correct. So he's quoting Hawking here, and this is coming from a discussion back in the, like, I believe the 90s, which is based on work from even before that, where Hawking is having a discussion with Roger Penrose, another extremely well-known mathematical physicist, and they're talking about singularity theorems, and they happened to do some work together, proving some singularity theorems, and so this is sort of written for, this book was sort of a discussion between Penrose and Hawking, and the book was called The Nature of Space and Time, in case anyone's interested. It's sort of like a public record of this discussion between these two like giants of cosmology. And in Hawking's first lecture, they call them lectures that they give in this book, he has this quote in here. And so it's a little bit weird because given that it's to a sort of a lay audience, there's a sense in which scientists or physicists can be somewhat, I don't want to say inaccurate, but they're trying to speak in ways that people understand, right? So in some cases you have to sacrifice precision in some cases for understandability. And I suspect that's somewhat what's going on here, because at the time, this just isn't the case that everyone thought that the universe had a beginning. And it's not even clear that Hawking himself believed that exactly, like that there was this absolute beginning to everything, because of the singularity theorems. He ended up, if he did think that at the time, he did, it seemed, change his mind, because he went on to do work with um, James Hartle, and they came up with something called the Hartle-Hawking model, in which there was no beginning to the universe. So they came up, and that might be what Frank's referring to when he said he tried to explain it without God. I find it hilarious that he just says he failed. Like, he gives no reason he gives no explanation like why he thinks he failed. He's just like, I want my audience to know that he failed, but I think that's more just Frank thinks he failed. But it's still a model that's considered, so I don't know why he thinks that he failed. But Hawking came up with a model called the Hartle-Hawking model that doesn't have a beginning, and it's a perfectly plausible model. I mean, there are debates about all these things, so it's like not everybody thinks that it's true, but it's certainly something that's still in the running that could be true, possibly, as far as I know. So I think that's a bizarre thing to just pull out this one quote. And then the other thing to say would be like, okay, well, even if Hawking did think that, or even some people thought that at the time, like, so what? There are lots of cosmologists out there, and again, this is one of those things where there's not agreement. There are lots of cosmologists who think that there was no beginning, and there's various ways that can be the case. And in fact, Roger Penrose is one of those. So the very person he was discussing with doesn't think that the universe had a beginning. And Roger Penrose also has come up with a model that is consistent with all the data that we know, and yet does not require a beginning to the universe. So I think it's just sort of a way for Turek to pick like a superstar of physics and like, see, look, even Hawking said this, and it seems like it supports what I'm saying. So it's one of those things where he's not really showing the real picture. He's just sort of cherry picking these things and avoiding all the context and the deep controversy and all the confusion. This is like difficult stuff. This is like really deep stuff, and there's just no definitive answer that we know of for a beginning or anything or otherwise. So yeah, I didn't. I was a bit irritated by what he said there.
All right, so let's go on here.
It was indisputably that the universe had a beginning. It's going to take you to think for just a second. Let's take a look at this timeline. Here's today, there's yesterday, there's the day before yesterday, there's last week. Let's say we don't know how far this timeline goes. My only question is this: can this timeline be infinite into the past? No, why not? Not everything starts somewhere because God didn't start somewhere. Can't add to an infinite. That's part of it. What's that? This is the interactive portion of the program. Yeah, you would never get to today if there were an infinite number of days before today. Why? Because if there's an infinite number of days before today, before you got to this day, you'd have to live an infinite number of days. You'd always have to live another day, another day, another day. But since today is here, there can only be a finite number of days before today. I do realize this can give you intellectual constipation. But just think about this. This is called the Kalam cosmological argument. If the past were infinite, today never would have arrived.
Yes, so he calls that the Kalam cosmological argument, but that's not correct. So this would be this is often an argument used in support of the Kalam cosmological argument, excuse me, but this itself is not the Kalam cosmological argument. So the Kalam actually says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then this is usually used as a supporting argument to support the second premise of the Kalam. So I don't know, that's just a little nitpick, but this is not itself the Kalam cosmological argument.
Okay, so let's go on.
Which means time had a beginning. If time had a beginning, what could have caused time? Only something outside of time. That something outside of time must be eternal, because that something outside of time didn't have a beginning itself. Whatever that thing is, that's the uncaused first cause. This answers the question, if this is God, who made God? No one made God. That's the whole point. He's the uncaused first cause. He's outside of time. He didn't have a beginning. Now, let's just jump to the bottom line of this argument. If the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner. The evidence leaves us with one of the following two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, here's my...
Hold on. That's apparently we have an atheistic view. We all got together, there was a council, and we all voted and decided that number one's our atheist view.
Yeah. It's true. Did you miss out?
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this was a spot that I thought was, so again, I was talking to a little bit with Joe Schmidt about this from Majesty of Reason. So if anybody's not subscribed to him either, you should check him out as well. He does a lot of great stuff. But I was talking with him about this a little bit. Again, I have some suspicions about the way Turek presents these things. So again, Joe is encouraging me to be charitable, which is good. And there's kind of a couple ways that you could understand this. So I agree with you. Like, one is like, okay, the atheistic worldview, that's problematic. But I think there's also some ambiguity in one. There's a couple ways you could understand what Turek might be saying here with number one, or what he thinks the atheist is saying. One way that you could understand what he's saying is that, and what leads me to think this is kind of the way he sets this up and the way he talks about it. But again, I mean, I want to try to be charitable, but one way you could understand this, and the reason I think he thinks this is absurd, is that there's sort of this idea of magic involved. Like, all right, there's this thing called no one, and it's doing this thing called, or it's doing this creating, right? So no one is carrying out this creation act of something out of nothing. And that's juxtaposed to someone creating something out of nothing. And clearly that sort of way of thinking about it would be absurd, right? To treat no one as like a noun, and this thing, no one is, to reify no one, and that thing is creating something out of nothing. That's clearly like nonsense. And I think people would rightly think that number two is more reasonable, even though that also has problems. Or you could think of it just as the straight up negation of number two, right? So the atheist more likely would say, the theist says, okay, someone created something out of nothing. The atheist says, no, that's not the case. And so what's the negation of that? Not anyone create. There is no one who created something out of nothing. And I just don't see on that understanding why that would be unreasonable or bizarre, right? Yeah, I don't think a person created something out of nothing. But that leaves open lots of other possibilities of what actually did happen. So yeah, I think the way Turek phrases this, there is still some part of me deep down that thinks that maybe Turek is setting this up on purpose to sound absurd. Like he wants his audience maybe to think, that atheists have this weird view that nobody carried out this action of creating something out of nothing. But I'm not sure. I can't say for sure.
Okay, so let's go on.
Do you realize, ladies and gentlemen, that everyone believes in at least one miracle?
So this is kind of where,
I mean, Christians believe in this miracle and many others, but atheists believe in one miracle.
I think that sort of supports what you were saying, your suspicions about the way Turek's coming at that.
yeah. So again, I was talking with Joe about this, and it is still possible that maybe he just thinks both interpretations are miraculous in some way. I don't really know what he means by miracle here. He just sort of throws that word out there, and treats them as if it's the same thing, right? So someone creating something out of nothing clearly would seem like miraculous, but I'm not sure why no one creating something out of nothing would be miraculous in the same way, unless he means something weird, like there's this noun no one who's creating something out of nothing. But maybe he thinks that any option is miraculous, whether it's some kind of quantum fluctuation. I don't know. So maybe he just thinks any option is miraculous no matter what. But I still think that's just a bizarre thing to think. So I don't really know what he means by miraculous here in terms of number one.
Okay, so let's keep playing.
They believe that no one created something out of nothing. Now, which view takes more faith, do you think? Yeah, number one takes more faith.
It's the one that the
Now,
atheist
think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. If space, time, and matter had a beginning, as science shows and philosophy shows.
All right, so I know you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, so again, it's just one of those things where he's like, science shows this, philosophy shows this, it's definitive. And again, he's just sort of like glossing over so much of the literature on this stuff, and the disagreement, and the nuances of all these different positions that one could take. And he's just sort of flat out just saying, yeah, our view is the one that takes less faith. He doesn't give really any reason for thinking that. He doesn't even give the audience really time to react. He just says, yeah, it's number two is the more reasonable one. And so again, I get this feeling that he's just leading the audience along, right? So he's just kind of guiding them where he wants them to go. And that just strikes me as not good thinking. It's more of like a sales pitch. He's guiding them. He wants them to buy his product. So that, a lot of the way he presents this, again, it's very difficult for me to be charitable. I know I need to be, but he makes it very hard sometimes, where I'm like, this is just, there's something fishy here, the way he presents this.
So let's look at the next example.
The God of the Bible, but we don't know if it is yet. But we've got 6 attributes that line up with the God of the Bible. By the way, Leibniz, a famous philosopher a couple hundred years ago, asked this question: if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? I mean, if there is no God, why does anything exist? Why does the universe exist? Why do you exist? Why does the sun exist? Why does anything exist if there's no God? There's got to be an uncaused first cause. You can't go on an infinite regress of causes. So that's the cosmological. There's a lot more in the books. We're going to spend more time on this.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I don't know why he. I don't know why he thinks there can't be an infinite regress. So that's a very common. I've seen that a lot. You know, is apologists will bring up this problem of an infinite regress, but again, I don't see why that's necessarily a problem. I don't think he's shown or really explained very well what the problem with an infinite regress necessarily is. Again, there's a lot of assumptions that are being made here that I think could be challenged. In those cases, if those assumptions are abandoned, there's no problem necessarily with an infinite regress of certain kinds. And so I think he just sort of, again, he is playing on a lot of people's intuitions. You know, most people don't really think about infinity, you know, maybe every day, and what it would mean to have an infinite past or things like that. So these topics people can have maybe some intuitions about them that are understandable but completely wrong, right? So infinity is tricky. In mathematics, right, we study infinities and things like that, and Georg Cantor was kind of the one that pioneered how to think about infinities, but they are tricky and you have to be careful with infinities. But a lot of these things can be solved and can be made sense of, and I think he's just sort of playing on some natural intuitions that people might have that are not necessarily correct. So, yeah.
All right, let's go on
This argument, the design argument, and there are two aspects to this argument. The universe appears to be designed, and you appear to be designed. Let's start with the universe first. In recent decades, scientists have discovered the universe is fine-tuned to support life on Earth.
Have scientists found out that the universe is fine-tuned?
Yeah, so this is another one of those places where
it's definitive.
It's
they
definitive.
found out.
Yeah, they have discovered for sure that the universe is fine-tuned. Again, it's the problem with kind of like what he means by that. I mean, he kind of goes into it, you know, saying that there's all these like remarkable coincidences and such, but exactly what fine-tuning is supposed to mean is not always clear, and there's disagreement about it. In fact, there are cosmologists again and physicists who don't think there's really any fine-tuning to be explained. And he just kind of again sort of glosses over those debates that are happening and really aren't giving people a clear picture of what exactly, you know, is the case that science has found. And he just, yeah, again, he's just kind of declaring this is the case. So yeah, again, that's another one of the spots where he's just sort of painting a picture that's not quite accurate.
Okay, so let's go to the 42-minute
needed to be. Also, the gravitational force, if it were altered by more than 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, compared to the strong nuclear force, we wouldn't exist. What's 1 part in 10 to the 40th power? That's 1 part in 1 with 40 zeros following it. You say, Frank, I can't get my head around that number. I know, neither can I. So let me give you an illustration. Take the entire North American continent from Central America to Greenland and stack it in dimes all the way to the moon. That's 238,000 miles. And then do that on 1 billion other North American continents. And then take all those dimes, put them in one huge pile, mark 1 dime red, mix it in, blindfold a friend, throw him on the pile, ask him to pick 1 dime at random. The chance he would pick that 1 red dime is 1 chance in 10 to the 40th power. Is he going to pick that dime? No. No. This kind of fine-tuning is just almost incomprehensible. And this is just one of about a dozen of these. Change any one of them, we're not here. And if you throw in the universe, the solar system has about 100 of these features that if you were to change any one of them, we wouldn't be here. In fact, let's take a look at our solar system here for just a second. Where are we? Right here, third rock from the sun. If we were just a little bit closer to or a little bit further away, we couldn't survive. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It is That's a lie. It's way too hot here in the
Just let me know when you want me to stop.
summer.
Yeah. So yeah,
The
a few
axial
things.
tilt.
We can stop for a second. There's a few things to say so far. One thing I forgot to mention, because he did bring up Leibniz before. Why is there something rather than nothing? I just wanted to add real quickly that I'm not sure that's like a meaningful. Well, it's a meaningful question, but there seems to be this assumption that there could be a state of nothingness. Like I tend to think, my personal opinion is that like it's metaphysically impossible for there to be absolute nothingness. I just don't even think that's a possibility. So I would agree that something exists necessarily. I'm not convinced that would have to be God. Beyond that, though, back so now progressing to his next move, which is to go to this design business or fine tuning stuff. So this is one of those things where he kind of dazzles people. Like he kind of has these nifty little graphics, and he throws out a bunch of like really interesting factoids, like kind of dazzles the audience with huge numbers. And again, I think it's somewhat distracting from the argument here, or kind of, again, just kind of leading them along and not allowing them to really think through the claims here. And he's just sort of using these like grandiose numbers to sort of like, oh yeah, that how could that happen by chance? And again, he's sort of ignoring some of the major issues. Like he's saying, if you were to change these things even a little bit, right, we wouldn't be here. And I think that's problematic for several reasons. One, it assumes that you can change things. Like, what does he mean by changing these constants? Like, what would change them? Maybe in some final theory of physics and cosmology, right, there may be a reason to think that the values are what they are because they have to be for some reason, right? I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. It's just that hasn't been ruled out, that there's some kind of like something that sets these parameters and they have to be that way. The other thing is he's not very clear, except for, here he says this, he has this like ratio from the gravitational force compared to the strong nuclear force. And he pulls out this like really big ratio and says that, if it changes by even this tiny amount, it's going to have like these horrible effects, or it's going to make a universe without us in it. And so another problem with that is that, well, maybe we wouldn't exist, but maybe some other kind of life would exist, is another issue that needs to be overcome. What exactly is life? What constitutes life? Under what conditions can life exist, right? Maybe certain types of life might be ruled out if you change the parameters, by this much. Does that mean any possible or conceivable form of life is ruled out? You're going to have to do more work to show that. And then usually, the fine-tuning proponent, whenever they're making these claims about these like remarkable these sensitivities, these very small sensitivities in these various parameters, usually these very small values are obtained by supposing that every other parameter is fixed, right? It's the same as what it is, and then looking at what happens if you alter this one and only this one value, and then looking at, is that going to have some kind of disastrous effect? And I read a book a little while back by Victor Stenger. Some might know who that is, but he was a physicist who was an atheist and kind of vocal in the religion sphere as well, and actually wrote a book kind of arguing against the idea of fine-tuning. And so he pointed out that, when you fix all the other parameters and you just adjust one of them and only one of them, they can seem pretty sensitive. However, if you sort of allow for other parameters to change in compensation with the change in one parameter, you get a lot more variation that's possible. So like if you change the gravitational constant and you allow other parameters to change with it, to compensate for the disastrous effects that might have, then if you allow for some compensation in the other parameters, you get a far greater degree of variability that will still allow for even life like ours. And so they kind of picked these very special scenarios where you're only adjusting one parameter at a time, and then calling that, like, oh, well, see, any kind of change is disastrous. Where it's really like, no, it's possible maybe if there's a change over here in the one parameter, maybe there's some compensating changes that happen over here, and then that sort of fixes everything, and then you'll get a universe that's perfectly fine to support life. And so he's kind of overlooking that. So these are some things that, again, he's just sort of giving a very surface level view here. And then the other thing, can't remember if he talks about this. He might, I think he does in the book, but I can't remember if he does it in the presentation here. He's also overlooking, right, some other models that can account for fine tuning, like perhaps some multiverse models, right, where all different kinds of parameters are realized, and in which case it's not very unlikely. Now, of course, these are all very speculative things, very debatable, and I'm not saying that there aren't replies to these things, but again, Turek just gives like no indication whatsoever that there's even anything to be said except for what he's saying here, and that this is just like, nope, this shows it. And so that's really disappointing, I think.
All right, so we're gonna fast forward here just because we're running low on time.
Yeah, there's a lot.
So I know you wanted to cover this one.
And it doesn't have a mind of its own. There's got to be an external mind directing it toward an end. This is what Aristotle called the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s AD, and he said, this is going to be my fifth way to argue for God, that all of nature's going in a direction. If it's going in a direction, some mind is directing it. Now, I get endlessly frustrated with atheists who mischaracterize this argument. They don't understand that Aristotle and Aquinas are not talking about the Big Bang cause way back when. In fact, Aristotle mistakenly thought the universe was eternal. What Aristotle and Aquinas are saying, even if it is eternal, you need a mind right now to keep everything going. It's a right now cause. In fact, God is to the universe what a band is to music. If a band were up here playing music, the band would be creating and sustaining the music. What would happen to the music the second the band stopped playing? Music's over. Same thing is true with God. He creates the universe, the natural laws that govern it, and he creates you, and he sustains the universe, the natural laws that govern it, and he sustains you. If he were to pull his hand away, the universe would go out of existence. It's a right now cause. This is why the Apostle Paul came along and said, in him we live and move and have our being. And Christ holds all things together. And the writer of Hebrews says, God sustains all things by his powerful word. So it's not just a cause way back when. They're talking about a cause right now. He's present. You ever wonder why we can do science? Why can we do science? Because the universe is orderly. And it's consistent and persistent. This is why you can find reliable cause and effect in the universe, because it's directed. It's not random. There's a lot more in the book Stealing from God. We don't have it here, but it's a book I wrote on this.
All right, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, there's, man, where to start? Okay. So I think this kind of brings in two things, like, so, because he brings up again the idea of being a first cause, creating the universe to begin with, and then he's got this idea of a sustaining cause. And by the way, I would recommend, for going deeper into this, Joe Schmidt again and Dan Linford wrote a book, Existential Inertia, and I think it's Classical Theistic Arguments, that kind of deals with this claim here of this sort of like continuing cause, and the need, like, for some reason to have a mind that sort of perpetuates the existence of the universe. So just shout out to them, to go into far more detail. But I think there's several problems. I mean, so when he says, and I kind of think there's related problems here, he claims, that the idea of someone creating something out of nothing is the more rational view. It takes less faith. And then I'm guessing, he thinks that that equally applies here, is having a mind that sort of perpetuates the existence of the universe. He seems to have like this constitutive view. So like when a band plays, the music is just constituted by the playing of the band. And so he seems to have this idea that, the universe somehow is like I don't know, constitutive of God's like willing, maybe, in some sense. But I find that I don't know why he just says that this is like the rational thing to think, because I really don't have any idea what it means for a timeless, spaceless um, mind uh, to be able to bring something into existence out of nothing, right? To cause like what I don't understand how there's what connection there is between a willing of this spaceless, timeless mind and the coming into being out of nothing of a universe, and then also sustaining that thing. So it seems like he also has to think that God. I don't know if this is Turk's view or not. If he agrees with something like William Lane Craig, who thinks that sans the universe or without the universe, God was timeless. And then once God brought the universe into being, God also became temporal as well. The way Turek seems to talk, he seems to talk in such a way that God is always timeless. And if that's the case, I think there's maybe even more of an issue here. Like I don't understand what it really means to say that this timeless or atemporal mind is like sort of uh, perpetuating the existence of this universe in time, which is a temporal thing. And so, yeah, he doesn't give much detail here, but I think there's some conceptual problems here that, by my lights, seem like it's almost completely incoherent, and would require quite a bit of faith to actually explain that. So he just sort of like, yeah, states that a mind is needed for some reason to have some directionality, which I see no reason to think that that's the case. I don't see why causal structure couldn't just be built into the fabric of the universe, right? So there's a flow of time. There's this entropy, second law of thermodynamics, development, right, throughout time. This causal structure. He just sort of just asserts that a mind has to sort of direct that for some reason. I don't know what the mind is doing extra. It just seems like he's adding on to this sort of this ad hoc thing that I'm not sure what work it's really doing. So it's a very bizarre claim, in my opinion.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the moral argument.
This argument, we need to start with football. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? That's when he throws it to the other team and they take it back for a touchdown. How do you know? This is the interactive portion of the program. How do you know? What's that? Their jersey, but you don't, that's not enough. You need to know more than that. Close. What? Not just the rules. What's above the rules? You got to know the purpose of the game. If you know the purpose of the game, then you can say, oh.
I'm going to let him go on, but that was the weirdest analogy to introduce the moral argument I've ever heard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it leads into some issues, but yeah.
Let's go on.
Yeah.
Oh, the touchdown gets us closer to the purpose, while the pick six takes us further away. If you didn't know the purpose, you couldn't make judgments as to whether or not this was a good play and this was a bad play. Now, notice in football, the purpose of the game comes from outside the game. When you guys, who are you playing this week? Mississippi State, right here? Okay. When the Tigers show up and play Mississippi State on Saturday, the rules are already set. The purpose is already set. The players just show up and they play, right? The purpose and the rules come from outside the game. They come from the NC2A. And every year or so, they may tweak the rules a little bit. Why? Because the rules are arbitrary. In football, they could be different, right? In fact, when they first started football, you couldn't pass the ball. Everything had to be run, right? So they changed the rules, okay? Now, it's true in life that the rules do come from outside the game, and so does the purpose, but they're not arbitrary because they come from the creator. And if there is no creator, if there is no God, you can't say this is the right way to live and this is the wrong way to live, because if there is no God, there is no purpose. Just like you can't say a touchdown's better than a pick six.
So there, I think, is one of the issues. So he, like you said, he has this bizarre analogy. I mean, okay, so morality is apparently somewhat like football. The rules are created in some sense from outside the game. It's not created on the spot with the players or something like that. But he agrees, so that this is a constructed thing, that the rules of this game or any other game are constructed, right? There's just a matter of agreement between the people who are going to play the game, and so in some sense they're arbitrary. So he acknowledges that, but then he's quick to say, okay, so morality is like this. The rules are made from outside the, I guess, game of morality or whatever, or the system of morality. But then he's quick to throw in there, but they're not arbitrary. And why aren't they arbitrary? Well, he just says because they come from a creator, which I thought was very bizarre, because he just got done saying how a bunch of people created the rules of football. So, I mean, the rules of football are also from creators. I mean, not necessarily just one creator, but a group of creators. So it would seem, by the same logic, that right, so they're not arbitrary. It seems like he's having a double standard, or special pleading here a bit. That, okay, so I'm not sure, like, in what sense, just because the rules of morality are coming from his creator or who he thinks created it, why that doesn't make them arbitrary. That doesn't seem to follow. So that's one big issue that we run into right away.
Okay, anything else to say about that, or this section of the presentation?
Of morality in general?
Or just the does God exist portion of his presentation?
Yeah, so real quickly, I think morality is like his favorite argument. He said this in a presentation before. He really likes the moral argument. I personally think it's probably the worst argument for God's existence, just because I think either way, so as we were discussing before, atheists hold different positions. There's no the atheist position on pretty much anything except for perhaps the existence of God, which, by definition. But there's atheist philosophers or thinkers who are moral realists, and there are those who are moral anti-realists. And either way, I don't really feel like the moral argument is very good. I think if someone is an anti-realist, they're just not going to accept the premises of the argument. Well, either way, so an anti-realist is going to deny the second premise, that morality is objective, and they're going to have a way of explaining, moral talk and discourse in some other way. And I don't feel like he gives a very forceful case for, where a moral anti-realist would have to agree with that they somehow can't use moral language in the same way. But he's also just flat out wrong that you can't have objective morality without God. So he just, again, it's one of those things that he kind of states over and over and over again without giving much justification. He just sort of says, well, if there's no God to sort of be the arbiter or, to adjudicate between things, then it's just your opinion versus, the other person's opinion. And if Frank had done, any reading in moral philosophy, he would find out that's just not true. It's not true at all. There are quite a few atheistic moral theories that take morality to be objective. They just don't ground it in the commands of a being or the nature of some transcendent being. And Frank just seems to think that that's the only way you can do it, but it's not. So, I mean, there are other ways to do it. Some people take moral truths to be sort of like Platonic truths. They're just necessary truths that exist, like the truths of mathematics. They are necessary. And there are ways of grounding truths in, there could be irreducibly normative facts about reality. And that doesn't necessarily require there to be any kind of supreme transcendent being, right? That could just be part of the nature of reality, is that there's these irreducibly normative facts. There are others who ground it, in harm-based things. So there are ways of making it objective with respect to well-being. These are just all things that have very deep support, and there's a lot that goes into these philosophies that can't be dismissed this easily, where it's just like, well, if there's no God, then it's just your opinion. So there's a lot there that Frank is missing, and he tends to just do this over and over again, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I guess for the sake of time, that's what I'll say there. He's just not addressing the vast literature that's out there, and again, painting an inaccurate picture for his audience.
Okay, and for the sake of time, I'm making a judgment call here. We'll go over number 3. I'm gonna skip number 4. Obviously, is the New Testament true? Is an important question. It's one of the central questions of my channel. I'll have on Craig Blomberg next week. We're going to be discussing the reliability of the gospel. So that'll continue to be a theme of my channel. I'll continue to talk about apologists and their claims when it comes to the New Testament. But let's look at number 3 real quick.
Okay.
So let me pull that up.
God, for that, we got to go to point 3, are miracles possible? You're probably looking at your watch. How is he going to get through this? Look, number 3 is the shortest. It doesn't take very long. The problem is a lot of people think miracles are impossible, like Noah. Hey, Christians, can we just admit something in this room? We'll just keep this between us tonight, that Noah and the ark is crazy. It is. A resurrection. I already asked you guys, how many people in here have ever seen someone rise from the dead? Nobody raised their hand. Yet if you're a Christian, you have to believe something that none of us have ever seen. And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a whale of a tale or a tale of a whale? What is the deal with Jonah? Can you actually believe in Jonah? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? It's not the resurrection. Yeah, the greatest miracle in the Bible is... I got some of you a second time.
He got me a second time.
The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible.
Okay, I want to stop right there. If that verse is true, everything else is possible, or every other miracle is possible. So does that mean, so he's a Protestant, does that mean Marian apparitions are possible? Does that mean, more Mormon miracles are possible? Are we just sticking to the Bible here?
Yeah, I think he definitely wants you to focus on the miracles he wants you to focus on, for sure. And again, I think that's something that's hard to really answer. There's like so much, again, there's so many things to consider here, depending on what he means by possible. I mean, yeah, it's logically possible that these miracles could have occurred. There's nothing like contradictory necessarily about any of these things, but if he means something else by possible, like, is it nomologically possible, metaphysically possible, so if this being can somehow bring into existence, or it's not even clear, like, if this being is just starting off a small tiny point and letting it inflate into the gigantic universe, does that mean it can do whatever it wants within that system? I mean, I don't know. It depends on what that being is capable of doing. He just sort of leaps to the idea that God can do anything logically possible. But I mean, it's not clear that just because a being brings the universe into existence, that it can therefore do anything logically possible. I mean, maybe that's the only thing it can do. Maybe it exhausted its power bringing the universe into existence and is stuck outside of it or something. I don't know. It just seems like there's a lot of things to consider here, and he's again kind of jumping the gun. I think that might be a non sequitur. Just doesn't follow that this being could necessarily do anything. But again, depending on what he means by possible, is it logically possible? Okay, sure, it's logically possible. I don't think that gets you very far, but I'll grant you that much. It's logically possible, sure. But like you said, yeah, like which miracles are we going to then consider as true candidates for having occurred?
Just the biblical ones. For some reason.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Well, and take the example of somebody like Anthony Flew, who gets used a lot by apologists. I think he would agree with, I don't know if he would agree with Genesis 1:1, but he would agree that God created the world, right? Created the universe. But he wouldn't, and he would say that the resurrection is possible. I mean, they use that quote. They quote mine that quote where he says something along the lines of, the resurrection is like the best attested miracle, like religious miracle. But what they leave out is that Anthony Flew, despite all that, still rejected the resurrection. So he would say, yeah, the resurrection is possible, but it's not plausible, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So possible, there's a huge gap between possibility and probability, or
Right.
even there's these three P's: probability, possibility, and plausibility, and they're all different, related things, but different. Um, and yeah, it's not enough to say just that something is possible. That's a pretty low bar, depending on the type of possibility you're talking about. And yeah, there's a huge, or could be a very large gap between something being possible and it being probable, or worth even taking seriously. So even on something like quantum mechanics, it's possible you could walk through a wall, right? That there's just the right way of phase transition, that the uh, things work out just right so that you could walk through the wall. That's possible. um but it's pretty much like you can take it as like, um effectively not going to happen, right? It would be something you would never, ever, ever even consider expecting to take place. So, yeah, it's one of those things where it's, yeah, okay, great. Even if we grant you this, that doesn't mean at all that it's worth taking seriously. And even with the idea of Anthony Flew, I don't even know to what extent he really did accept that God existed. I know that they do use him a lot. I've heard stories. I'm not sure if they're true, so maybe someone else can verify this or if they know more about this, but I think he was sort of very old and perhaps not quite all there at the end. And I've heard stories that perhaps he was taken advantage of a little bit, but I could be wrong about that. But I take with a grain of salt sort of these claims that Anthony Flew, well, he agreed, he changed his mind about these things and now thinks, God exists and all these things are worth maybe considering. So I'm not so sure about that. So I don't know if anybody else knows more about that, but I've heard some maybe um, suspicious things about whether all those things are true with Anthony Flew.
It's just so weird that they always cite him and use that quote because he never became a Christian and he continued to reject the resurrection.
Yeah.
I've never understood the quote mining of Anthony Flew. Um, so any final thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the miracles thing, I can't remember if he goes, he does. This is his shortest section. He does make some bizarre claims here, though.
Okay, so let's go on.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's true that God created space, time, and matter, can he do whatever he wants? It's not logically impossible inside of space, time, and matter? Of course. Here's the interesting thing. Atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse.
So
They
see,
don't
there's
think it's
that non
God, but as
sequitur.
we
Yeah. There's that non sequitur. So like, yeah, if he brought the universe into existence, can he do anything not logically impossible? No, I don't think that follows. I don't think you can get to omnipotence from bringing a universe into existence. I think that's quite a leap to say you can do this one thing, therefore, and even if it's a very impressive thing, right? I would be pretty darn impressed with a being that could will a universe into existence. That's for sure impressive, but I don't think it follows from that then this being can do absolutely anything that's not logically impossible. That just seems like a big jump right there.
Right, and the nature of the presentation is so fast moving, and he's asking these questions in such a way they're like, "Oh, well, that seems right."
Yeah, they're leading questions, exactly. They're very leading.
All right,
And then
let's
again, yeah,
go on.
he brings up our friend Stephen Hawking and just sort of says, yeah, they're admitting this. But again, it's like admitting what exactly? Um, it's not what he's saying.
Okay, so let's go on.
We pointed out, what else could this cause be? It flows straight from the data that if space, time, and matter had a beginning, you got to have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause. So if God can create the universe out of nothing, can he raise Jesus from the dead? Of course Noah's crazy, unless God exists. Of course Jonah's a fairy tale, unless God exists. God can do all these things.
Unless God exists. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's this issue of, again, is it is it crazy? Okay, so it's not crazy because God exists. Maybe it still is crazy. Like, depends. I mean, you have to make a lot of assumptions about this being that you're saying exists. So, like, could it do it? Sure, maybe. But then it seems to be the case that, like, is he saying you should take everything as not crazy? Like, so, like, anybody could make a wild claim. And well, as long as you admit God exists, my claim isn't crazy, right? Um, I astral projected through the earth and, visited some other planet. Like, that sounds crazy, but if God exists, it's not crazy because he could let me do that or something, I don't know. So to me, it's like, you can't just say, well, because if God exists, then now these things are somehow far more likely to be true.
Just think
Um,
about if somebody from like a wacky, crazy religion argued this way.
right.
Scientology is crazy unless God exists, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think he's getting anywhere with this. This isn't like getting him much. This isn't getting him much purchase with his claims. It's not like there's no problems with them, just because even if someone has reason to think that God exists, um, what reason do we have to think that God would want to do these sorts of things, right? In fact, some of them might even be less likely. Well, maybe not less likely, but might be extremely unlikely still. Like, if there is a being of a particular type, then there's questions of this being, like, why would this being want to flood the whole world and do it in this particular way? Like, you have to sort of assume all these things about this being, in order to, I don't know, make this likely. And those are extra things that you have to pile on, to this idea of, so it's not just God existing, it's a very particular type of God existing with very particular goals in mind, and very particular desires. And the more you pile on there, the less likely, that um, prior probability is going to be, or of this being. And so yeah, he's just not really doing his position a whole lot of, it's not getting him very far. So yeah, I don't, again, it sounds, in the moment, it might sound like to them like, oh yeah, okay, I can see that if God existed, then yeah, that would be more believable. But I don't think that's necessarily I mean, no one's like saying the reason I can't believe Noah's Ark is because I don't think God exists. So, it's like the very question is whether that even happened to begin with, it's not like the question is, how do we explain Noah's Ark? um, we have to somehow give a natural explanation for it. Well, it's like, no, it just didn't happen.
All right, let's go on.
Things. In other words, if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse is at least possible. You just can't.
That's a big if.
Yeah.
It's a huge if.
But I mean, it's like, okay, like, sure, Frank, I'll give you that. Like, so what? It's at least possible. Yes, I will agree with you that at least if I'm saying, like, it's logically possible that these things could be true. But again, are they likely? I don't think so. I don't think they're at all likely.
Can't rule it out. Now, the problem is a lot of people rule out miracles because they've never seen one. That's not a good reason necessarily to disbelieve something because you haven't seen one. You believe in a lot of things you've never seen. Like your mind. Have you ever seen your mind? You're using it right now.
So
like
weird.
The laws of logic and the laws of math. Have you ever seen those? No, you're using them right now. You believe in justice. Have you ever seen justice? Oh, you may have seen people treated justly or unjustly, but you've never seen it directly. Why? Because it's not something you see directly. It's an immaterial virtue grounded in the nature of God.
But see, that's sort of the point. Like you don't see justice, but you see like the effects of justice. You don't see a miracle, but you can see the effects of miracles, right? We hear all the time about contemporary miracles. So I think when somebody says, "I have never seen a miracle," that's what they mean, right? So I don't understand what he's.
Yeah, and I think he's using, like, seen, he's overly, I think he's being overly literal here too, in some sense. Like, and he's making some assumptions like, you don't see justice as if it's sort of this abstract Platonic form. Now, if you're a Platonist, you'll agree with that. I tend to lean that way, so I'm fine with, okay, yeah, I haven't seen the thing in itself, justice, as an abstract sort of object in some sense. But someone else could be like, well, yeah, you do see justice. Justice is just justice just consists of those occasions where it's carried out, right? The when someone receives justice or something like that, so it's not like someone has to agree here and be like, yeah, justice is this abstract Platonic form that I can't see in and of itself. Someone might be saying, yeah, no, we do see justice all the time. It consists in those occasions where it occurs in real life or something like that. And then, yeah, you do see it. So those aren't really like good examples necessarily. But yeah, I think it's like when you see a miracle, I don't even know that miracles do leave effects necessarily. Maybe some do. Like, I don't even know. Like, I mean, if something is like a one-time thing and it can't be verified, it's not clear in what sense it necessarily has to leave an effect that people can verify. In the same way that we can have good reasons to think that these other things exist, like love or justice or mathematics, where we're using them in some sense. We have really good reasons to think they exist because of our constant interaction with them, even if we can't directly perceive them in whatever way he means that. Whereas a miracle is like this one-off thing where, maybe some people have some very limited access to it because maybe they observed it or something. And then even then it's not clear, did they observe it correctly? Were they mistaken? Were they hallucinating? Were they, there's maybe all these other things that have to come into account, taken into account. And then it's like, well, what evidence then can you give after that miracle has happened, that it was a genuine miracle? That's tricky. So, I mean, I don't think it's as straight, clear cut as like, well, there's lots of other things you haven't seen, but you think exist. So therefore miracles are likely or something like that.
All right, let's go on.
You've never seen love, and everyone believes in love. In fact, in the second debate with Christopher Hitchens, some kid at the College of New Jersey during the Q&A asked Christopher this question. He said, Christopher, what is love? And Christopher, being a materialist, meaning he only thinks that molecules exist, he thinks everybody's a moist robot.
What were you saying?
I was saying, I'm not sure if that's true or not. Maybe if someone knows, I'm not sure if Christopher Hitchens was like a philosophical materialist, like complete reductionist. I'm not sure this is another thing Turek tends to do, is he sometimes makes assumptions about what people believe based on their atheism, because he equates atheism with materialism. So in many cases where Turek says what atheists believe, it's because he has sort of this view that an atheist is a materialist, and that's just another thing that he gets completely wrong. Atheists do not need to be materialists. In fact, atheism is completely consistent with all kinds of bizarre views, of immaterialist views even. There are some atheists that even believe in souls. I believe Michael Huemer is one of those, who's a very well-respected atheistic philosopher. So he's not, when I say like there's an atheist who believes in souls, it's not like there's this crackpot random person out there. But there, and now I don't know exactly Michael Huemer's exact views on what exactly a soul is, but all that to say that there are these views that are not materialists that atheists can hold. Lots of views. They just don't think a God exists. And so
I want to read this. I want to read this comment real quick. The Free Thinker said, Turek, see this random off the cuff comment some semi-popular online atheist said, therefore that is what atheism is. That pretty much sums up the presentation.
Yeah, yep. I feel like that's what he does. So all that to say is I don't know if he is correct that Hitchens was a materialist and thought that molecules and only molecules or atoms or whatever existed. So I would say, if for people listening to him, to take that with a grain of salt, very small one, and maybe double check that. Maybe Hitchens said somewhere that he subscribes to materialism, but Turek thinks every atheist does. So
Should we go on?
I'm willing if you are. Yep.
Okay.
right? He had to come up with a materialistic answer to love. And so after he hemmed and hawed for a little while, he finally said, love is a chemical. And I said to him, don't tell that to your wife.
That I don't know.
Honey,
either.
do you love me? Yeah. What?
What was that?
I would like to find that debate. I know it's pretty easy to find where he debated Hitchens. I can't remember if he's debated him more than once, but again, this is sometimes where I'm like, did that really happen the way you're saying it did? I don't know that Hitchens would have said love is a molecule, like as if you could put it in a bottle or like synthesize in the lab, like the love molecule. My suspicion is that Hitchens maybe said something more like love is facilitated by chemical processes in the brain, and
Let's see if I can find it.
there's some truth to that. The feelings we have and the way we develop affections and attachments to people are definitely involve chemical processes. So again, I think maybe he's being a bit uncharitable here by attributing to him that love is just a molecule. I don't know. That could be maybe Hitchens did say that, but I'm a little skeptical.
I'm trying to see if I can find it. It's probably gonna be too hard to find.
Could be. So maybe if anybody who's watching has a little time, did Hitchens
But I will
ever claim that?
I will say that oftentimes in his presentations, Frank will say something like, Bart Ehrman says this and Bart Ehrman says that. And I think it was Apologia that had Bart Ehrman on to basically show that, no, that's not what I say at all. So yeah, you should probably actually look up what Hitchens actually said, not just trust what Frank said. But let's go ahead and let's play on.
Yeah.
Why? Because I got the chemical today. Tomorrow I might not have it. No, love is not a chemical. Love is a choice that you make to treat somebody in a way that seeks what's best for them. But it's not something you see directly. By the way, you've never seen gravity. Oh, sure, Frank, we've seen it. There it is right there. No, you're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity. We really don't even know what gravity is. Did you know that? You've never seen George Washington, yet you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a man who lived from 1732 to 1799. Most of you have never seen Bo Jackson either. But he's left effects behind, and you know he existed, and still does, by the way, but even though you've never seen him. Same thing is true with Jesus. You may have never seen him physically, but he's left effects behind that help you understand that he exists. Now, do you realize that miracles don't have to have occurred since the first century for Christianity to be true? There could be no miracles since the first century and Christianity would still be true. I think there have been miracles since then. In fact, Craig Keener, who's a brilliant researcher at Asbury Seminary, a decade or so ago, wrote a hernia-inducing 2-volume set on modern-day miracles, where he documents all these. But even if Keener's wrong, Christianity could still be true, even if miracles haven't occurred since the first century. And if
I am willing to bet that Frank Turek has not read either of those volumes of Craig Keener's book.
Probably not. I've also heard some people address Keener's book, and again, people can double check on this that I'm not misrepresenting him, but I think Keener sort of admits, even in his book, that he wasn't extremely rigorous. He just was sort of aimed at collecting as many accounts as he could basically get his hands on. And so there's a lot of criticism surrounding, even though they're very large books, and of course there's no shortage to miraculous claims. There's all kinds of bizarre claims that are out there from so if you were to compile all the miraculous claims from all the religions, I mean, you'd get far more books than just two. So it's not surprising that there's lots of claims out there, even from other religions as well. But again, what's more likely that you got people who will make stuff up. You've got people who may have been in circumstances where they were just mistaken or misperceived things. There's all kinds of ways that people can be mistaken. Um, and Keener himself and some people have gone through his different accounts of these things and have basically realized, well, he wasn't exactly rigorous. This wasn't like wasn't like a rigorous study that he did.
Can I give an example?
Yeah, please do.
So it's been a while since I looked into this, so I hope I don't get some of the details wrong. But I'm pretty sure Keener was interviewed by Lee Strobel for his book Case for Miracles, and he lists
Okay.
one of these examples of, I can't remember the girl's name, but she had MS and she apparently was cured of it or whatever.
Mm,
And the doctors are on record saying we don't know how to explain this. It's a miracle. Blah blah blah.
hmm
Well, one of the doctors he lists in the book, I just Googled the doctor's name. That's all I did.
uh-huh.
And what I pulled up was this doctor is involved in a miraculous healing ministry.
Oh,
So one of Keener's biggest examples was this testimony of this woman, or the doctors of this woman. And one of the doctors is this guy who's literally involved in miraculous healing.
interesting. Yeah, I think that does sound um, vaguely familiar. I think I have heard that as well. That's interesting. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, it's like not exactly objective there.
Right. So any other thoughts on that bit?
Um, yeah, not too much. Again, I think I think he's just sort of he's trying to prime his audience to come to certain conclusions. Again, I don't think he's really showing anything that makes it worth taking seriously any of these claims that he's made. Even if you do want to concede that, yeah, it's possible. That's again a low bar to clear. So
So
sure,
Nick Andrews wrote, "Yeah, Hitchens just seems to be saying that love can be explained through evolutionary means and it does not need some source that exists outside of our minds."
yeah, that's what I would think too. But again, Turek sort of has an agenda here. I mean, I would like to be charitable, but I feel like again he's sort of leading his audience on and sort of painting this picture that again is sort of. I mean, I keep saying this, but I think it's true. It's a mislead. It's got some there's some things that are correct in here. He's got some truths in here, some things that are accurate, and then he weaves it in such a way that I think it paints a very misleading picture that doesn't get you to the conclusions he wants you to reach. So he's using a lot of rhetorical tactics, I think, mostly.
So I want to circle back to what I said towards the beginning, the principle of charity. And
hmm
one of my biggest issues, as I said, was not simply that he uses bad arguments. I mean, he does, or that he's not charitable, which he's not. It's that we saw, for example, I showed that course. He's training other Christians and lay apologists to argue this way, to play these rhetorical gotchas and just regurgitate these sound bites. And I just don't find it helpful. And I think we see the results of that online with the conversations we try to have with online apologists who kind of just regurgitate this stuff.
hmm Yeah, and I think the problem with a lot of these apologists is that I mean, in being so committed, I mean, this is the issue I have with apologetics in general. So, a lot of times if you criticize apologetics, they'll bring up, well, apologetics just means that you're giving a defense. And it's like, yeah, technically the word apologetics, comes from the Greek apologia and means to give a defense. You're right. But the way it's carried out is absolutely not just giving a defense. It's right. It's a very closed-minded sort of system where you start out with a conclusion and you've made it your mission to defend that conclusion pretty much at all costs. That's your job. You've made it your job. And the problem, I mean, I would hope it'd be obvious what the problem with that is. It's not truth directed. It's just conclusion directed. What you would like to be true, or what you've committed yourself to being true. And the thing with Turek in these courses that he puts out is that because it's his job, he doesn't really honestly, at least I don't think he honestly engages any of the actual depth of the content that's out there. So he kind of gives this air of sophistication and that this is logical and that you're doing like philosophy, but he's not doing philosophy because he doesn't engage the philosophical literature at all. In fact, many people have responded to these arguments, and his presentation never changes. Like his presentation, if you watch various times that he presents this I don't have enough faith to be an atheist presentation at college campuses over the years, it's nearly identical all the time. He says the same things, same jokes, gives the same support, and he never updates it. And that's just not what a good philosopher does. Good philosophers, like, even there are lots of theistic philosophers I highly respect, like Josh Rasmussen is one of my favorites. And one thing I love about Josh is that he will admit when an argument's bad. It's like, yeah, someone addressed this argument, and yeah, we shouldn't use this argument, right? So we're going to take what we've learned from this person who's leveled this objection, and we're going to, either jettison the argument completely, or we're going to have to rework it in some way that circumvents the problem. And with apologists like Turek, you don't see anything like that. You don't see engagement with the material. You don't see acknowledgement when a particular argument, or at least a version of an argument, has been either knocked down, or at least some very good objection has been leveled. You're like, yeah, okay, we need to address this. Here's what I think could be some ways of working around this, but we're not sure. He just always gives this same idea that, nope, we've definitively solved this. And even atheistic scientists are agreeing. He just says that same stuff over and over again. So that's what I find most frustrating about this. And like you said, he passes this on and sort of passes on this false confidence. And I mean, maybe ultimately Frank is right that God exists, but he's not defending that idea in I don't think, a legitimate way, or giving people really actually good reasons or strategies for addressing this question. And most people are just, like you said, getting these sound bites, these sort of gotcha little tricks. And he makes mention in his talks that he wants people to be able to think and not just be told what to think. But it's a bit ironic that that's kind of what he's doing. The end result is people who use these tricks without really understanding what they're doing, and they get this air of confidence that's just unwarranted, I think. So it makes it difficult.
That's why I wanted to show that tweet at the beginning that he used to promote his "I don't have enough faith to be an atheist" course, because he said, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, we should be having conversations with atheists, we shouldn't be dunking on them. That seems to be like the entire presentation model, is to dunk on atheists, make them look silly, make them look foolish. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I think what you guys do at Real Atheology is you have meaningful and substantive conversations with theists. You don't try to make them look silly or dumb. You just try to understand why they think what they think and why they believe what they believe, and try to point out why you don't buy those reasons. And you guys challenge each other, and that's one of the things that I think apologists could learn from that. I think they could learn from philosophy of religion Twitter. You
Yeah.
guys get along, you're friends. You don't agree on things, and that's fine, but you have good conversations. And somebody like Frank Turek, I couldn't have a good conversation with Frank Turek. It wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
He,
Yeah.
he would be trying the Roadrunner tactic on me.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to turn everything you say into, so you're saying this self-defeating statement? Like, no,
Is
I'm not.
that true?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So part of our goal at Real Atheology is to kind of elevate the discussion. And so we really try to highlight, like really good, serious thinkers on both sides. So we'll interview atheist philosophers, but we also often bring on theistic philosophers as well, like Josh Rasmussen is one. And Dustin Crummett is another who's very good. And then, yeah, we just explore these issues, and we don't always agree. Obviously, we don't agree with them on things, but we definitely learn from each other, I think. And that's where you can see the progress. You get to see a little bit of progress, whether it's mutual understanding or, we sharpen each other's positions. And so that's really nice to see is, dealing with the best. So I think it is worth addressing sometimes these apologists because of the reach they have. But it is always good. Like, we want to try to elevate that discussion. We want to try to point it to better thinkers. So even if you're a committed theist, committed Christian, even, it's okay to realize that Frank Turek is not the best person to represent your view. It's okay to criticize him. Even, there are better thinkers you can fall back on, and look to. And it's the same with atheism too. It's like, not every atheist does a good job defending atheism. There are some equally horrible atheistic defenders out there who you might call even atheistic apologists. And just because I agree with them in principle doesn't mean I have to agree with or support the arguments they use or the tactics they use. Some atheists can be very nasty to theists, right? And so I don't condone that sort of thing. So I think it's good for everybody to try to be the best versions that we can, and to think clearly and try to use the best arguments. Admit when we're wrong. Admit when an argument is bad, even if it supports our desired conclusion, right? Or something like that. And that's what we try to do at Relay Theology. And even the guys at Relay Theology, we don't always agree on things, right? We have different viewpoints on certain things. And so, it's all about learning. We're all in the same boat here. I mean, I feel like that's one of the things, like I said at the beginning, my biggest problem with Turek is mostly just this sense of confidence that he exudes that I think is unwarranted. Even if, he can believe it all he wants, and that's fine. But to paint a picture of the sort of confidence you can have for a position that isn't warranted, I think that's problematic, because as I study, and learn things, I'm just like, man, this life is horribly confusing. It's very confusing. I mean, you go into any area of philosophy, any interesting area of philosophy, and foundational stuff, epistemology, ontology, any kind of metaphysics, and you get to like these foundational topics, and it doesn't take very long till you hit extreme disagreement, right? These problems, or those things. What exactly is truth? How exactly do we know things? Is morality objective? Um, these sorts of fundamental questions. What's the ultimate nature of reality? These are extremely difficult questions. I mean, these are just not. Oh, that was the one thing I wanted to say at the very beginning. We didn't play this part, but Turek says, before he introduces those 4 questions, he says, I think it's really easy to establish Christianity, I think he even says prove Christianity. He says, all you have to do is answer these 4 questions. And I'm like, well, hold on here. The number of questions you have to answer to determine if something is true is not indicative of how easy it is. Um, I'm sure plenty of people can remember being in college and were given exams with maybe like 3 questions on them, and yet they were like insanely hard, So it's the issue is like, what are the questions? And those questions are not easy to answer by any stretch of the imagination. These are all incredibly difficult questions, and you have people, extremely intelligent people on both sides, who disagree and have disagreed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years on these big topics, thousands of years even. And so I think it's almost insulting in some sense when apologists be like, yeah, this is like, this should be definitive. This should be settled. Like, you can show that the atheist is an idiot, in some sense. And I wouldn't want to say that to the theist. Some atheists, unfortunately, will say that theists are idiots. And I think that's an unfortunate thing to do. I agree. Maybe there is a God. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it to me, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it's just absolutely obvious one way or the other. Maybe certain versions of God, it's more obvious that they don't exist, but if we're speaking fundamentally, about the fundamental nature of reality, these things aren't at all obvious. And so I think we should give people or each other a little bit more charity. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but yeah.
So one of the things I would suggest to folks is if you want to see a good example of a debate with Frank Turek kind of modeling this pop apologetics approach versus more of a philosophical approach, go and look up his debate with Jeff Louder, Secular Outpost. It's a really good debate. I always label it style versus substance because if it's on style, sorry, Jeff, but you weren't very good. Uh, and Frank, as we've already established, is a great communicator. He's very quick on his feet. He keeps the presentation going. Jeff's the opposite. He's very methodical. He's going through the philosophical literature. It's kind of dry. It's kind of boring. But sometimes you have to do the dry and the boring work, right?
Yeah.
And so I would just recommend that debate for folks. And then the last thing I would say is I was interviewing a Christian. I'm not going to say which one. I've only interviewed a few Christians, so it can't be hard to narrow it down. But after the show, we just got to talking, and they said, "Yeah, I just love your tweets on Frank Turek." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" And they're like, "Yeah, I love when you roast that guy." And I'm like, "What?" And they're like, "I would love to do a podcast with you sometime where we just talk about bad apologetics." And I'm like, "Are you calling Frank Turek a bad apologist?" So,
Respect.
there are apologists that recognize this isn't the right approach.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I would recommend to those apologists is speak out more on this. There seems to be some apologists that recognize that this stuff ain't very good, but they don't like to name names. I mean, I understand you don't want to have strife within the brotherhood or whatever, but sometimes you have to name names and say, "Hey guys, this isn't the right approach. This isn't the right way to argue for this." And so if you're a Christian apologist out there, number one, my takeaway is be charitable. Just be charitable. Number two, don't assume things about people. Ask questions. You saw the "Does Truth Exist" portion of this presentation. Frank, he would get a lot further if he, instead of playing these gotchas, he would just ask good questions. What do you mean? And then lastly, be willing to call these guys out. I've had another Christian apologist friend of mine tell me that he would never recommend a Lee Strobel book. But you'll never find this person ever criticizing Lee Strobel publicly. And it's sort of like, you don't have to make it personal, but these people are like the most well-known and influential apologists. So if they're making bad arguments, you need to come along and correct them. Do you have any thoughts on that before we
Yeah, I think
finish
that's
up
good
here?
advice. Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And I think, of course, lest anybody get sort of offended and be like, "Well, what about you guys?" I think that's good advice for everybody. So I think it also holds on, the atheist side as well. It's good when atheists hold each other. We're not as organized of a, you know, every atheists disagree on a lot more than Christians do. Just because it's not a unified, it's not a worldview. That's another thing that Turek gets wrong, is atheism is not a single worldview.
We
But
decided all these things at a council. You
yeah,
get
we
one
had our
today.
own councils. Yeah. But nevertheless, atheists are, united in discussing and disagreeing with theists. And I think it's still good for atheists, to point out when other atheists or non-Christians or non-believers are, say, using bad tactics as well. Because, obviously, it happens. Both sides have, they're terrible players. So if the Christian was like, "Well, what about you guys?" Yes, I would agree. That would be good advice for all of us to follow, to call out things when they're, even on our own side, when they are not legit, whether it's logically or just even like dialectically, in those conversations, if we're being overly critical or mean, or, assuming things about people, psychoanalyzing, all those kinds of things can be pointed out. But yeah, I would like to see some of that from apologists a little bit more, especially, these people who become very, very influential. The thing that makes me worried is how influential someone like Turek is. He's not just this podunk, guy who says goofy stuff that we can laugh at, and not take seriously. Yeah, he's traveling. I mean, he does these talks all the time, like weekly, and he's got these podcasts, and he's got his own television show, and he's got these courses that he's offering. And so he's really putting it out there. And then, he's partnering with people like Ray Comfort, who's even worse.
Well, and he's rubbing shoulders with kind of the political stuff, like Charlie Kirk and all that. Like he
yeah,
spoke at a Turning Point conference, I think.
and I think he's had Charlie Kirk on. I think they do actually some
Yeah.
collaborative stuff on a regular basis. So that's frightening. So this, bleeds into a lot of areas that are like very relevant. And so it would be nice, to see a little bit of pushback there from some real thoughtful Christians. Yeah, absolutely. So, and Frank's not the only one out there. I mean, there's, you got like J. Warner Wallace, who's very similar, Greg Kukel, like you said, Lee Strobel. These are all guys who have like huge ministries, and they all kind of use these same tactics and these same sort of strategies. Yeah, got their own little twists on it, but they're kind of this collective. And unfortunately, they're the ones that have like the most reach, where it's like, I would love it if someone like Josh Rasmussen or, Dustin Crummett or some of these other really great theistic philosophers, Christian philosophers even, had more a farther reach. And the hard thing is that someone like Turek makes it a little bit more, like you said, he's engaging, whereas like some of the other philosophers, these more sophisticated philosophers, can be a little drier, and it's very technical, and it's hard. It's hard work. It's hard thinking. I don't know, but I just want to encourage people to push themselves a little bit more, to think, try to go a little deeper and look past some of these really superficial arguments that a lot of pop apologetics relies on.
All right, Ryan, and I so appreciate you coming on Potential Theism today. I do
Thanks for
want
having me.
to, yeah, absolutely. I do want to point out to our audience that on January 16th, I will have on Dr. Craig Blomberg. Speaking of Lee Strobel, Blomberg is one of the scholars that Strobel interviews in The Case for Christ. He also literally wrote the book on the historical reliability of the Gospels. In fact, that's the name of his book, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. So on Twitter, I gave skeptics an opportunity to ask him questions. So I'm going to compile those questions this weekend, and I will ask him on January 16th. All right. Thanks once again, Ryan, and everybody else. Have a good night.